Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. So we're going to run this review session similar to last time. I'm going to go through the main points of the lectures that we've done since the midterm, since the first midterm. You can stop me and ask questions at any point. So I have not had the opportunity to see the exam yet again, but he did say that it would be structured in the same way as the last one, with 55 questions, some of them being true, false, some being multiple choice. Gordon, you're getting into trouble. Come here. And so you can expect the same type of exam, just obviously on different material. So I'm going to pull up slides here. Thought I had them open, but I guess not.
Is tomorrow's material also going to be on the midterm?
Yes, so tomorrow's will also be. So, and then I don't know if you guys saw, but he did post a study guide type thing that, I mean, it's basically a list of the studies that you need to know, but that can help direct your studying. So that I think it includes a little bit about what's going to be tomorrow, but if not, just base it on whatever we go over. Here. Come here. You're in trouble, mister. Here. You have a sweater. So I'll start us off on the mental representation. So this was the first lecture spilling over into, I believe, this second one after the midterm. So this is unfortunately the one that was not recorded. So did my best to reconstruct everything that happened. I know it's frustrating that you can't listen to that. So it began with talking about this experiment by Warner, 1968. And the interest here was in people's memory for verbal information. And so participants start out, they heard these instructions that they were either told that they were going to be needing to remember the exact wording of this memory task, or that they didn't need to know, or they were not warned that they were going to do this. So they either knew ahead of time that they were going to be quizzed on the exact wording of these stimuli that they were supposed to be, that they were being shown, or they were not told that this was a memory test. And so what they were measuring was the ability to remember these actual items. And we're going to get into more about what these items were, but what they manipulated was that they changed whether the meaning changed in the set of things that they were testing you on, or whether just the style changed. And so what they mean by that is if you were presented with an item like this, so when you score your results, do nothing to correct your answers, but mark carefully those answers which are wrong. And then if we compare that to when you score your results, do nothing to correct your answers, but carefully mark those answers which are wrong. Can anybody say whether this is an example of a style change or a meaning change?
Style change.
Yeah, exactly. So this is where it really means the same thing. It's mark carefully or carefully mark. That means the same thing, so we wouldn't interpret those differently. It's just a style change. The meaning of the sentences isn't actually different. Those are the same too. And then we can compare that to ones where there's a meaning change. So when you score your results, do nothing to your correct answers, but mark carefully those answers which are wrong. Or when you score your results, do nothing to your correct answers, but carefully mark those which are wrong. So if we compare the green to the blue sentences, that's going to be a meaning change, where you're either correcting your answers or doing nothing to your correct answers. That actually changes the meaning slightly of the two, whereas the differences between the green with each other are just a style change, and the blue, if you compare it to the other blue sentence, that's also just going to be a style change. Does that make sense with the differences between meaning and style? So they had participants, they were presented with one of those sentences, and they're asked to recognize it for style or meaning. Those are the differences there. And so when they were presented with ones that had the same meaning, the subjects were 100% accurate in recognizing the meaning of the sentences, but when they changed the style, they were really only about a chance unless they were warned to pay attention to the certain wording of the thing. So basically, unless the participants had a heads up that every specific word mattered, they really missed these small changes in style, which makes sense in terms of our economy of memory. Why would we need to pay attention to things that mean the exact same thing, but there's just a word differently? It wouldn't make sense for us to encode all of that information. Of course we can, because if we're warned, then the probability of getting it right goes up to about 80%. But we're not as good even then as we are at remembering when the meaning is there, or when the meaning changes. So this graph is just showing those same results. So when they're not warned, over on this side, so they don't know that they're going to have to remember these certain things that they're going to be quizzed on this. Their memory for the style of things is very low, only about 50% of the time are they correct, but their memory for meaning is very high. And that's high whether they're warned or not warned. It's basically a straight line across the top in terms of statistically. It's not a significant difference between being warned and unwarned. People perform really highly for meaning. But for style, when they're warned, they do much better, up to 80%, but still not as well. Questions on that study? So then turn to the Shepherd 1967 study. And so here, participants were looking at 600 different images that were basically cut from magazines. And then after an hour of being exposed to these different pictures, they're presented with two pictures side by side. One is one of the ones that was a part of this 600 picture list that they had seen before, and one would be new. And they're supposed to determine which one is the old one, the one that they've seen before. So what they found is that, and if anybody remembers exactly what he meant here, so he talks about the verbal information being pretty good with some error and visual information being nearly perfect. I think that what he meant was that sometimes they're tested on whether the two words are the same, or whether the two whether the word for the image that they saw was one that they had seen before, or whether they were actually presented with the image itself again for this one. And so this is just saying this in a graph, but the pieces that are important here is that, so when they had the words, they did quite well, about 88% correct, which is about the same as 11% error. So they were pretty good at recognizing when they'd seen one of those words before. And with pictures, they were even more accurate. So they were highly accurate at remembering visual information that they had seen before, and picking that out and saying that was the new one and not the one that was the one that they'd seen before and not this new image that was shown next to it. And it's especially impressive because they did this with a bunch of different kinds of paired images. So you would think it'd be very easy in this novel one where so the one on the left is the one that they'd seen before, and it's paired with something that's totally different that they hadn't seen. So you should be pretty good at picking out a boat versus whatever this is. Napkins versus a clock. Those are very different. It makes sense that we would be able to pick out what we'd seen before versus what we hadn't. But they also did it with these images where it was basically another exemplar of that same thing. So starfish and another example of a starfish. And then they also did it where it was the same object, but it was in a different state, they're calling it. So here, these are all, it's called an abacus. They're all lined up here. Here they're spread apart. Here the egg is totally clean on the outside. Here it's a little wonky. The bread is in the box. The bread is out of the box. So it's the same stimulus, but it's actually in a different state within the image. And what's interesting is that people do really well for memory of all of these different things. So they're slightly better with the novel stimuli compared to the old one. But they do about as well with the exemplar and state compared to one another. So we're pretty good at picking up what we've seen before. We have good memory for visual information. That's the key point here. But other evidence shows that we don't have very good memory for visual information. So this is the example with the penny, and people are just horribly bad at figuring out, at noting which is the correct penny. They do even worse when you make them draw it from hand. They get a few of the main features, but we really clearly are not encoding or able to retrieve all of the aspects on the penny. So this study by Nickerson and Adams showed that, in fact, we have pretty poor memory for some types of visual images. And so these things these sets of studies are contradictory to one another. So the first two we looked at showed that we have really good memory for visual stuff, and this one says that we don't. So can we remember detail or not? How do we reconcile these different contradictory findings? So the tentative answer is that we can remember detail, but really only for features that are meaningful to us. So the idea with the example of the penny is that we know enough to recognize a penny compared to other coins, but it's not meaningful to encode these small little things of where exactly the date is, where in God We Trust is unprinted, but that's not meaningful information. It's not something that we would need to know in the same way. So we can remember detail, but we're not very good at remembering detail that isn't meaningful. And the idea is that the bread being in the box or out of the box, or those state changes, or the novel versus old stimuli, that those are meaningful changes. And so we're adept at recognizing that type of change and remembering that type of visual information. Questions on that?
So in the slide, it's making a statement about what two people think versus what another two set of people think. On the example, he prefaced, like, I guess the experiments for each people, or should we like know the names of these people and what they did?
So I would like to be able to say you don't need to know the names, that he should give you that detail, because that's what he said before, but y'all probably noticed on the last exam there was one or two questions where it was really helpful to know the name. And so he shouldn't be doing that, but I think as much as you can remember a name to be aware of that. But I think the key point here is to know that there were two studies that showed that we do remember visual information well. So be familiar with the details of that study and what the point was, and there's another one with the pennies that shows sort of the opposite in how we integrate this information. Does that help a little?
Yeah.
And this is only what asked you thing here at the bottom, just that we do much better when we know that that's what we're going to be testing on. That we can remember very specific levels of detail, but we have to be warned, and that goes back to the first study where they warned people or didn't warn them that this was a memory test. Makes me think that I watch way too much and CIS and all the agents in there are very well trained to take conscious note of these things. It's basically like they're always walking around being warned to note all of these different changes in their environment. So now we're talking more about this meaning versus style issue. And so in this study by Mandler and Ritchie, participants studied 8 pictures of scenes for 10 seconds each. And they either did this type change versus token change. And type literally just means this a meaning change, like you actually change something about the type of image in the scene or the type of story that's being told in the scene, versus a token change, which is essentially a style change. We'll see some examples of those. So they're presented then either with the original image that they had studied, or one with a type change, or one with a token change. So this looks like, for example, this is the original image here. B would be the token change. The only difference is that her pants went from being striped to polka dotted, so doesn't really change the meaning of this scene. Hopefully what your teacher's saying means the same thing no matter what they're wearing. Versus this third image, this is a type change. The image that the teacher is teaching off of has changed, and so that changes the meaning of the scene in some way. It went from being maybe a history class to an art class or something. This is just zoomed in. And so this is a complicated graph, but the point you need to get from this is that people do really well at remembering, at picking up when there was a type change and not a token change. And so what these are saying is that when you add an object, they're quite, higher here is more accurate. They're quite good at recognizing that that's changed, whereas when just the size of something is changed, we do much worse. The organized versus unorganized, I believe, just refers to how things in the image are arrayed. Is it an organized image, or is just there other random items in this? So obviously, if something's organized, there's more meaning to it. So they tend to do better on the whole with organized versus disorganized. But the key point being that when you make a type change, there's much better recognition that that's occurred than a token change. Questions there? So moving right along, memory and meaning. So this is another study showing similar principles. That here the main point is if the item to be remembered is not meaningful, then people do pretty badly in memory tasks. And so this is demonstrating that by had they read people this description about this procedure is actually quite simple, and it goes on in a very abstract way to talk about how you do your laundry. Like you put stuff in one pile, and you sort it into two different things based on characteristics of the item, and if you don't have enough to fill this second thing, then you only do one. And it's basically saying how you do laundry, but you don't know that it's about doing laundry. It could be about any sort of boring task where you're sorting something. So that's group one. They don't know what's going on, but they're read this really abstract, obtuse type of passage, and then they're asked later to recall the specific content of that passage, and people are really bad at that. Whereas for group two, they're told first that it's about washing clothes, and then they're read the passage, and then they're asked to recall. And now that they have sort of a schema to fit that in, they have some meaning behind that passage. People are much better at recalling the information in that passage. This applies well to studying, where if you're just trying to memorize a name to remember a name, it's much harder to remember. But if you have something to hang it on, some sort of broader framework that gives meaning to it, then it'll be much easier to remember that. Questions? And then also showing a similar thing is this study with the droodles, which are these sort of strange images that may or may not mean anything. We can see stuff in it. I think this is a chicken in the washing machine asking for help. I don't know. But they're weird types of images, and so participants are given like a set of these different images to study, these different droodles, and group A gets them with an explanation of what they are supposed to be, and group B gets them without an explanation of what they're supposed to be. So they're just told that it's sort of like a random image. And so in group A, people have to do really well with their recall, about 70% accuracy. But for group B, it's only just above chance. So with that, so again, it's showing the same exact principle here, where when there's no meaning attached to having to memorize a stimulus, we do very badly at that. When we have meaning to attach to it, we do much, much better. And so showing that 70% recall of these completely otherwise meaningless images just by adding explanation of what the image is. So yeah, the main point is that subjects' good memory for pictures tied to their interpretation of these pictures. It's not tied to having some meaning attached to it. So make sure this is still getting me. This is summing that up, that its implications of meaning for good memory is that to remember less meaningful material, you can convert it into being more meaningful material. And this is something that we do with mnemonics. So when we had to memorize the planets back in grade school, instead of just having to remember them as a list, we had little mnemonics to about the first letter of each that made a sentence, or the every good boy deserves fudge mnemonic for notes in music. So we have these things that we attach meaning to otherwise seemingly arbitrary stimuli to help us to memorize them. this is just talking about them more with foreign words. We can do it there. You can make sound alikes and try to connect things to meaning to help you. Now we're turning more to sort of the next chunk of this lecture where we're talking about categories and the information that's held in different categories. And so abstract categories, they usually carry information that holds true for all category members. So if we're talking about cats, sorry Gordy, they have 4 legs, they're usually furry, whiskered, and have a tail. I guess that counts for him too. And so we tend to assume that that holds true for all category members. Of course, you know, there actually are some hairless cats, but we'll get to that. And so categories are used to help with communication. They're very efficient. You don't need to describe every aspect of this animal to know that it's a cat when you can just say it's a cat. It gives you a lot of information in one small word, that category. It also helps us to make predictions about the world. And so we know about what cats are likely to do. We've seen cats before, so it tells you something about what this cat might do. So it helps us to get information about this class of objects and any individual object within that class. And so within hierarchical semantic networks, we have different levels of categories. So we can have the highest level category of being animal, and then below that, bird is sort of a subset of animal, and then we can have a specific type of bird, like a canary. And so the categories are these different nodes of this graph. So the nodes being where things connect. So this is a node, this is a node, this is a node. So those are the categories. And then the links between these categories are what he calls ISA links, or it is a thing. So a canary is linked to a bird, so a canary is a bird. A bird is an animal. A fish is an animal. A shark is a fish. A salmon is a fish. So that's what those links are. They're literally an is a link. It links these things to a category that they fall within, and they are an example of that. And then facts are represented as these statements that are attached to the nodes. So animals have skin, can move and eat. Birds have wings, fly, and have feathers. Canaries sing and are yellow. So this is what we're seeing on this diagram. And that the idea here is that also that facts are placed as high in the hierarchy as possible. So what that means is that, you know, even though a canary can fly, we don't list that down here because it belongs to the higher level category of bird. So canaries, we don't have eats down here because that's stored at the level of animal. And so all of what I'm saying here has to do with the theory of hierarchical semantic networks. What we're going to get into shows where this can break down, but if the questions were about what does a hierarchical semantic network represent, or what does it show, these are the kind of things there. And so then we're going to get to some studies that talk about why that doesn't always work, but this is like the theory surrounding how we store information. And so it is the case, and this is one of the issues with the theory, that facts aren't always true all the way down the hierarchy. So for example, with the ostrich, they don't fly. So you have to store a sub-rule here to remind you that even though it's a bird, it doesn't fly. And so in studies looking at reaction times, when you're presented with a sentence and you have to say whether it's true or not, if it's a canary sings, where people are very fast at recognizing that, versus a canary can move, because the sings is stored at the same level as canary, whereas move is stored all the way up here at animal. And so how does hierarchical semantic networks explain this? The idea is, we're going to get to a study that shows this, but the basic idea is that to decide if this statement is true, you take the word canary and you jump to the fact. And so if it's at the same level, you only need to make one step to get to the fact that it sings. So canary sings only takes one jump, but if you want to get to canary can move, we have to jump 1, 2, and then over to that. And so that should take longer because we have to get up the hierarchy to access that fact. It's not stored as closely in your semantic network as sings is with a canary. Yeah?
So when you're saying higher or lower, like if we're referring to the blue, canary would be lower, animal would be higher.
Yeah.
And then if we're referring to the yellow, skin would be high and yellow would be low.
Oh yeah, sorry, I was thinking of the colors of text, yeah. Then yes, skin would be high and yellow would be low. Because when we're thinking about hierarchical, we're thinking about like there's a higher order category and lower order category. So we can think about any class of objects. We get to that example of houses later, and so at the top could be buildings, and then houses, and then within a house it could be other things like that.
But it's not between blue and yellow, like blue is not more high than yellow would be. For example, canary is not higher than sings.
No, these are stored at the same
Okay.
level. Like, so basically, these are facts that are attached to this node of animals. So animals have skin, can move, and eat. And so they're all stored at the same level. Bird is stored with wings, flies, and feathers at the same level. The bird is the category, and the things in yellow are the facts about that category. Other questions on this? So then we get to the Collins and Quillian experiment, and so they're asked to judge these assertions such as canaries can sing, canaries have feathers, canaries have skin, as well as false assertions like apples have feathers. And so what do they find when people do this? They're assessing reaction times, and they find what we were sort of just talking about, which is that on the whole, it takes longer the further up the hierarchy you have to go, or the more jumps you have to make. So these are higher values here means it's taking them longer. Distance in network means how many jumps you're having to make. So up one level is 1, up 2 is 2, and so a canary is a canary. You don't make any jumps. People are very fast at that. A canary is a bird. You're making a jump. You're making 1 to the next category, so it takes a little bit longer than this first one, and then it takes even longer to recognize that a canary is an animal because you're jumping 2 levels now. And then when we're trying to attach it to facts, it takes even longer than that. And so we have a canary can sing, and then longer than that is a canary can fly, and a canary has skin. But all 3 of these are taking longer than it's taking to match it to a category. And the reason for that is presumably that you're having to make additional jumps. That a canary is a canary, you're saying right there, a canary is a bird, you're making this 1 jump. But you're having to make sort of an additional jump within that. You're jumping to the level of a canary as a bird, and birds fly. So that takes even longer. And so what they find in short is that verifying whether these sentences are true depends on how far of a distance you have to travel within this hierarchical semantic network. So network model distance is what that refers to, is how many levels you have to traverse to get to that fact in order to verify it. So then some things where this sort of breaks down a little bit is that a fact about a concept is, if it's encountered really frequently, it can be stored with that concept, even though it could be inferred from a higher order concept. And so even though, with the apples example, apples are a food, foods are eaten, but we're actually faster at recognizing that apples are eaten because we're so used to eating apples, we've encountered those 2 things together really frequently. So even though in theory it should take us longer to recognize apples are a food or can be eaten because we're making that jump up to the level of food, but because we use this so often, it's associated more closely, whereas apples have dark seeds. That is specific to apples, not all foods in general, but we don't think about that very often, so it's not well represented in that semantic hierarchy. So this is where it's breaking down, where our prediction from that hierarchy would show the opposite, but in fact we're faster to say apples are eaten than apples have dark seeds because of how frequently we encounter these different pairings of these stimuli. So the more frequently a fact about a concept is encountered, the more strongly that fact will be associated with the concept. The more strongly facts are associated with the concept, the more rapidly they are verified. That's just saying that same thing in words. So the more frequently we hear a fact about a concept, the more strongly we link the two, and then that means that we're faster to recognize that that's true when we see it. And so, whereas inferring facts that are not directly stored with the concept, that takes a longer time. So when we aren't storing it at that same level and we have to make those jumps, that's when it takes longer. Questions? So now we're giving another example about houses. And so here we're talking about categories that are not necessarily hierarchical. And so houses, we know that they're a type of building. Houses have rooms. Houses can be built of wood, brick, or stone. They serve as human dwellings. They tend to have rectangular and triangular shapes, so on and so forth. These are all things that are stored in the category of houses. And so when we're representing this kind of non-hierarchical information, we can do it in the form of schemas. And so schemas are similar to this hierarchical semantic network in the sense that it's a way of organizing information, but it's a little bit different. So with schemas, there's multiple different slots within a schema, and so each of those slots has some type of default value. So there are ISA slots, so a house is a building, that's one of the default values there. There also are made from default values, so a house is made from stone and brick, and so we have these sort of things that come most readily to mind, the most typical things about that category. Those are the default values. And importantly, this doesn't mean that other possibilities are not allowed. So there can be a house built out of cardboard. We can still recognize it, but that's not our default of a house. And so this is showing here is how these things are organized structurally. So here's our example of house, and so it is a link to it's a building, and so that's what links it to this higher level category of a building. And so ISA links allow us to have a generalization hierarchy, and what we mean by that is we can generalize up to a higher level. And so because buildings have rooms and a roof, we can generalize that houses also have a room and a roof because of this ISA link to building. Oops, where's my mouse? There we go. Whereas we also have these part hierarchies, or these have links, and so houses have rooms, for example. And so that gives us information about rooms by this link here. And then buildings also have, office buildings would have is a link to building also, and could have also a have link to desks or something in it. So the key point on this slide is just that within these schemas or this category learning things that we have these generalization hierarchies, and those are built by these ISA links, and those are what led us to infer that houses are human constructions, and then we have these part hierarchies or these have links that let us infer that houses have windows or ceilings. So basically we can go from our level of houses up or down. Questions there? So then we turned to this study, this Brewer and Trajan study, and so they had participants, they told them they were coming in for a study, but hold on a minute, we're not quite ready for you yet, so could you just wait in this office here? And that actually was the study. So they left them in the office for only about 35 seconds, and then they brought them into a different room and they asked them to recall everything that was in the office. So write down as many possible things that they saw in the office. So it looked something like that, lots of random crap in there. And so people were really accurate at recalling things that are part of the schema for office, that there should be chairs, there should be a desk, there should be walls in an office. That's basically our default values for things that an office has. So these fit well with people's expectations. But only 1/3 of the subjects remembered seeing books in the office. but there actually weren't any books in the office. And so this shows that we often falsely remember information that is consistent with our schema. So we expect there to be books in an office, so people remembered that at a pretty high rate of falseness. And then they also, fewer than a third of subjects remembered that there was a skull, which there actually was in there. But because we don't expect there to be a skull in an office, people were less likely to remember that, even though it was there. So they predicted and found that things that fit in the subject schema would be remembered well, things that did not fit would be recalled less well, but things that did not actually exist in the office but fit with the schema, those would be falsely remembered. So in some, we remember what we expect there to be, even when it's not necessarily there. But we're really good at recalling things that we expect to be there. This is just summing that up. In other words, that people infer that an object has default values for its category unless they explicitly notice otherwise. So unless they really noticed and paid attention to that skull there, they didn't remember it because it violated expectations. And then between sort of here and then these next set, I believe there was a bunch of slides on like Eleanor Roche and on some more typicality, but that wasn't on the study guide, so I don't think it's going to be covered. So we're going to skip that here. But he is going to have, because it was on the study guide, this last bit about scripts. I know we were rushing at the end of lecture, but we just need the main point of this, which is that scripts are very similar to schemas, but they're for events. And so, for example, going to a restaurant, we have these sort of scripts for how that goes. You go in, you sit down, there's a general flow of tasks that occurs. And so they were interested in determining the scripts people use, Bauer and his colleagues. And so they had the subjects name the 20 most important events that happened in episodes of just going to the restaurant. And so agreement wasn't totally the same. So people had like slightly different, this is just sort of two people's different things, slightly different ways of ordering these things. But the point is that on the whole, 73% of people had sort of the same stereotypical sequence where you sit down, you look at a menu, you order your meal, you eat your food, you pay your bill, you leave. So we're all organizing things in the same way. We're following a script here.
So, sorry, the slides in between we're not responsible for?
No.
Okay.
They're not in the study guide, so. So then, now that they've determined that people use these scripts, how does the use of these scripts impact our recall for stories? And so they had subjects studied a story that had some, but not all of the typical events in a script. And so they did two different variations of this where they either recalled the story from like with no prompts or anything, or they had to, or in the second one, they had to recognize whether a statement was in the story. So what did they find? That, so when they were asked to sort of blank recall, they recalled elements of the script that were not in the story. So with the example of the restaurant, even if it never talked about paying the bill, people remembered that having happened because it's part of the script. And same with recognition, they recognized statements as having been in the story that corresponded to the script, even if they weren't part of the story. So if they presented you with, did this happen in the story? Did they place their order, and maybe that wasn't talked about, people would still remember that being there. And then in a similar study, that this time, rather than leaving out some of the typical events, they changed the order of them. So they had 12 prototypical actions, and 8 of these were in the normal order, and then 4 were rearranged. So they, for example, they paid the restaurant bill at the beginning. That's out of order of our typical script. And so the result was that subjects had a really strong tendency to, in their mind, rearrange things back into the proper order and to remember that. So when they told the story back to the exome experimenter, they would put that paying of the bill back at the end where it normally is. Any questions on that? That's it for that lecture. Just want to make sure. Still going.
Okay.
Now we're on to our first memory lecture. So we're talking about amnesia, sensory memory, short-term memory, and working memory were the different chunks of this lecture. I think this also spilled over a couple different classes. So I like that he says it comes in 2 flavors. So we have retrograde amnesia, which means the inability to remember things from the past, and it's usually caused by a blow to the head or a stroke or a brain tumor, something like that. It's often short term, although it can be longer term. And then anterograde amnesia, which is the inability to form new memories. And so this is usually a permanent condition that's caused by damage to the hippocampal system, and so it's often due to, again, stroke or physical trauma, or sometimes Korsakoff syndrome, which is what happens when you drink too much for many, many, many years. Yeah?
Is retrograde amnesia, can that also be caused by damage? Or is it just?
If you had hippocampal damage, you wouldn't get just retrograde amnesia. You might get both for a bit, but like with the example of HM, which we're getting to here, so he had damage to his hippocampus because they actually cut that out because of his seizures, but because of that, it actually didn't damage his past memories. He had good memory for his past leading up to that operation, but he wasn't able to form new memories because of that damage there. Whereas the other tends to be damage to where those memories are actually stored in the long-term memory. So the hippocampus is about moving memories from short to long-term. So HM, most famous person studied for anterograde amnesia. So he was normally intelligent, had normal memory and all this, but because of his severe seizures, they operated and they removed part of his brain, and they had no idea that it would have this effect on him. This is how we learned that this was so critical to forming new memories, but they removed the hippocampus system, and so he was unable to form any new memories. He didn't recognize people that he met after his surgery, so no new episodic or semantic memories, nothing that's like you can self-report on. But they can learn some new skills, so you can learn new procedural memories. The famous story about him that actually wasn't in here is that he's an incredible ping pong player, but he doesn't know it. Every time they tell him to play ping pong, he says, "I never played this before," and then he's awesome because he has learned over the years to become a really good ping pong player. That is learned in a different way. That type of memory, the procedural memory, it's like learning how to ride a bike or to do those tracing tasks that they had him do. Those are learned through a different system. So you can still form those types of memories, but he's not able to report on those. He doesn't know that he's learned these things. So then, turning to sensory memory, this key thing is this whole report task, which is one of the sort of classic tasks that's used to study sensory memory. So subjects are presented with an array of letters that they're shown for a brief period of time, like 50 milliseconds, so really fast. And then they're asked to recall as many of those items as they can. And the results are that subjects only report about 3 to 6 items. They look something like this. This is the one that he was showing in class, where they flash this at people really fast and then say, "Tell me all the letters that you saw." And people are not very good. They only get about 3 to 6. I feel like I'd get like 2. And so subjects report that they're aware that there were more items, but that they faded away really fast. You couldn't really hold on to them and report them. People are very bad at this whole recall task. But as a variation on this, this guy George Sperling was looking at a partial report task, and so he used the same stimulus of that full array, but after it's presented, there's a brief cue that comes up on the screen with an error that tells you which of the lines of that array you need to attend to, or you need to remember. And then that's removed, and then you're asked to report what letters you saw. And here people are very accurate, either getting all or 3 out of 4 of them. So it looks something like this. So you get the same array, and then it goes away. You get just an arrow, and then you're asked what was the top row. And so, like I said, people are much better at this than the whole report task. And so the idea is that subjects have all of those lines somehow displayed very briefly in their memory, in their visual memory, which we call iconic memory. It's there, but that it's very fleeting. And so the idea is that we can't report on all of those different arrays because we can't hold on to it that long. But if we're very quickly shown which one they want us to hold on to, we can hold on to that for just long enough to say those 4, but we wouldn't be able to report on the other lines. So this is a graph showing that. And so what they were doing here was they were delaying how long it was between showing that image and then showing the array and then giving the arrow, and then when you have to actually report on that. And so the longer the delay is between being shown that array and being asked to report on it, the worse people do, and it goes down to almost the level of the whole recall task by a second. So you basically can only hold on to that array for under a second, and as the delay gets further and further out, people can remember fewer and fewer of the items in that array. Any questions on that? So this is why the memory for the actual display decays very rapidly and is gone within 1 second. This is just saying that dotted line is what you expect people to do when they do the whole report task, which we're just consistently bad at, no matter how long the delay is. So iconic memory, this is our short-term visual memory where we're holding that array for less than a second. And so it's also important that how good and how long that iconic memory for a certain set of items lasts. It depends on what is followed, what follows that display. So what I mean by that is, so like if you had this array like this, and then you were queued there, and then after it, this was pulled up on the screen. This would make it much harder to remember that top line, because now we've got something else that's interfering with that. So this is the masking effect. So we're susceptible to any type of bright or complex display coming up next will push out that other information from your iconic memory. Whereas if you get a blank screen, especially a dark one, it'll be easier to hold on to that longer. But new information, new visual information pushes older information out of your iconic memory. You can't hold on to too many things at once. So now we're turning to short-term memory. This lovely image of what it looks like. So short-term memory holds information received from our sensory stores if that information has been attended to. So that just means like what we're getting in from our eyes or ears. And so then that can get transferred into long-term memory if we rehearse it. And short-term memory only holds information for a short period of time. We're going to get more into detail of this, but that's a very, very broad overview. Yeah?
So is iconic memory part of short-term memory? So like the sensory information just goes into that section of the short-term memory?
Yeah, so iconic memory is a type of short-term memory, but just for visual information. But that's great. That's a great question. So it would be like a subset of it. And our short-term memory has a limited capacity that you can only hold a certain amount of items in it for a certain amount of time. So that leads us to that famous magic number study that we can remember 7 plus or minus 2 digits of information, that we can really only hold on to 7 pieces, like 7 items on a grocery list, or 7 digits in a phone number. I can barely do 3 these days, but they say stress impacts memory. It's definitely true. And we did an example of this in class, and our class showed the same effect, that most people could get about 7 of these in terms of remembering digits. So then the key point is that the short-term memory is this revolving door, which we sort of saw with that iconic memory study, that if you put something else in the door, then the thing that was in there before gets pushed out, sort of one thing in at a time. So information can't be kept there indefinitely. Either it gets pushed out by old information, or if you rehearse it a lot, it could move into long-term memory. Just trying to make sure I'm. So this is a study that's demonstrating that, where they were interested in how well people stored information based on the age of that information, and by age they mean like when they learned it. Did they learn it a while ago, or is it just being presented now? So subjects were given a sequence of 200 3-digit numbers, and they had to say when a number was repeated. So they could get like 199, 103, 106, 105, 199, and then you'd have to say, oh, I already heard that one, so that's a repeat. And so the independent variable, or what they varied or what they manipulated, was how many items were between the first and the second presentation of that number. So were there 8 other numbers in between, or 20, or 2? And so they were interested in how, what was the probability that the subject correctly said, this is a repeat. And what they find is that there's this lag, which makes sense, that so people are really accurate when it's the next one. Duh, like you say 199, 199, you get that it's a repeat. So their probability is 100%. This is 1 would be 100%. This is 60%. And so that drops over time as there's more and more lag. So once you're out at like 60 numbers in between, we're about a chance in guessing that's been seen before. So what this is showing is that you can't hold things in short-term memory for very long. You're no longer at this point holding on to the fact that you heard the number 199 60 items ago. There's too many different ones to hold on to. Questions on that? So this is just saying that memory drops off rapidly, and then that it's dropping to about 60% probability is that some of it may be passing into long-term memory, which is why it's just above chance, but most of it's not making it there, so people still aren't doing very well. So this is just saying that if we rehearse information, it's more likely to get into long-term memory, so the more you rehearse an item, the better you're able to recall it later. That's why we study. But then these other folks, Craig and Lockhart, say that it's not just how much you rehearse something that is important, but it's the depth of processing. It's how you're processing that information, not just how long you're iterating it over and over in your mind. And so what they mean by that is that like there's shallow versus deep processing. So you could sit down and just try to remember all of the words on a list that are, for example, parts of the brain, or you could sit down and really try to think about how those parts relate to one another, where they are in the brain as opposed to other parts, how they relate to what you learned in class. That would be much deeper processing. So to look at this, they had, I'll get to that in a second, but basically that information that's processed in a shallow fashion is less likely to be remembered. If it's processed in a deep fashion, it's more likely to be remembered. This makes sense. So the experiment, they showed subjects 48 words, and then for each word there's one of 3 types of questions that they could answer, which is either, is it printed in upper or lowercase letters? Does the word rhyme with some other word? Or does the word make a proper sentence completion in a given sentence? And so these are basically showing in increasing depth of processing. If you're just saying whether a word is upper or lowercase, you don't have to process the meaning of that word at all. Whereas if you're saying if it fits in a sentence, you're really processing that meaning. 2 is somewhere in the middle. You're not really processing the meaning, but you're getting a little bit more processing of the word and what it sounds like. And so these are basically three different conditions that subjects were in. So after they did the 48 words, subjects were asked to write down as many of the words as they could remember. And basically they did really badly for the words that were processed in a shallow way, and they remembered very well ones that they processed in a deep way. So another example is a study by Glenberg and colleagues, and so here they gave them a 4-digit number that they had to, for 2 seconds, and then they had to rehearse a word after that for 2, 6, or 18 seconds, and then go back and recall that digit. And so the sort of cover story that they give to the subjects is that the words are not important. It's just a disobstructor task while you're trying to remember this number. But actually, they were interested in memory for the words, so they tested them to see if they remembered that. And so subjects recalled 11%, 7%, or 13% of the words that were rehearsed for 2, 6, or 18 seconds. So basically, this is showing that how long you rehearsed it for didn't make any difference, really. I mean, because these are not statistically significant differences. And so recall was not impacted by how long they rehearsed this for. And the idea is that that's because they didn't process it in a deep way. They were just repeating this over and over again when they were trying to remember the number. Any questions there?
So whether or not you're cued really impacts whether or not you store it.
Yeah, so definitely whether or not you're cued is important. That when we're told to remember things, we can, but otherwise we don't really attend to things that don't seem meaningful. So it didn't appear to be meaningful to these subjects to actually remember these words for their meaning. They were just repeating them over and over again while they were trying to hold on to a number. So they weren't processing those in any deep way. So they didn't stick. Other questions? So now we're on to working memory. So this is Baddeley's theory of working memory. And this is just his theory that there's sort of these two different components of it. So the visual spatial sketch pad is what we're presumably using when we do something like a mental rotation task, where our working memory is sort of has this temporary image that is there that we can manipulate, which is why they mean like a sketch pad, like that you're almost in your short-term memory sketching this object and manipulating it in your short-term memory. And then we also have the phonological loop, which is what you're presumably using when you're rehearsing these lists of information, that in your short-term memory you're going, okay, dog 43, cat 62, seal 33, or whatever that list is. You're like rehearsing that over and over again to try to remember that. And so this can form an articulatory loop, which they call, which is what makes sense of that inner voice, that repeating over and over again to yourself. And then there's also the phonological store, which is what listens to that voice and then stores that information. So it stores the way that information sounds. And the central executive is just the piece of his theory that's guiding which one you're using when. So this is just like a schematic for what's going on in short-term memory. And then in one of his studies, he was looking at what controls the length of your memory span, so how many digits or items you can keep in there. Is also determined by sort of the playback speed of this articulatory loop. And so this was the example where he read 5 words to us in class, and then we had to repeat them back to him. And at first they were really short words, like wit, some, harm, bay, top. And then later they were longer, like 5-syllable words, like university, opportunity, aluminum, constitutional, and auditorium. And so people can remember much fewer of these because it takes longer to they take longer in that articulatory loop. So you can only hold on to basically so many seconds of information. So even though you don't have to say these words out loud to be remembering them, you basically are talking in an inner voice. And so the longer that playback takes, the fewer things you're going to be able to remember. So even though both of these lists have 5 words, you're not going to remember as many of the ones that are longer words, because they're taking up more space in this articulatory loop. So they only got about half of those longer words. So the crucial factor is how long you say the word. And then this is showing in a similar study with another colleague, Valar, that this percent correct that you're getting with the increasing number of syllables is basically tracking the rate of reading. So how long it takes you to read a word is tracking exactly the percentage you're getting correct in these lists. And so it's just showing again that this articulatory loop could only hold so much time of information. So the longer the word is, the more syllables there are, the less you get correct in terms of recalling those, and that tracks the rate it takes to read that. So this is showing that we can keep about 1.5 to 2 seconds of material that we're rehearsing in this loop, and that's it. Okay, so then turning to the role of the frontal cortex memory. So we talked a lot about the hippocampus in terms of amnesia and stuff, but what about the frontal cortex? This is also important to memory. So this is shown in this delayed match to sample task. So this monkey's food is placed in one of those 2 wells in front of it, and then so the monkey sees it, then they cover them and they prevent the monkey from looking, and then afterward they take that down and the monkey has to say where the food was. So monkeys that have a lesion in their frontal cortex, they can't do this. So even if their hippocampus is intact, they should be able to form new memories. They're not able to do this without the hippocampus being intact. And then critically also, human infants can't do this until 1 year of age, presumably when their frontal cortex is developed enough for them to be able to do this. So this is just showing that it's this Broadbent's area 46 that's involved in this delayed to sample task. This is part of the frontal cortex here. This is monkey brain. And so lesions in this area result really badly in this task. This region is really only firing during the delay period of the task, so while the monkey's trying to hold on to that. So that's the short-term memory it's trying to hold on to. It's in the right well or the left well, the food. And so different neurons seem to be tuned to remembering the object in different portions of the visual field. That's also important. And that different neurons are firing for remembering different things. There's a lot of specialization for memory in the frontal cortex. And then it's similar with humans, so using positron emission technology studies, we also, in addition to this area 46, we also have a prefrontal area 47 that's activated when the participants hold visual information in their working memory. So this might be the seat of the visual spatial sketch pad is the theory there. So like what would be activated when you're doing like a mental rote documentation task or something like that. And whereas verbal rehearsal things are in area 6. So that's up here. So the idea is that might be where the phonological loop is. Phonological loop. So this is just getting at where people are thinking the seat of these different short-term memory functions are in the brain. Questions on that? All right, moving right along. Wow, it's taking forever. Okay. So then we've got the ACT model. So this is when we had the different words, the Bible, animals, flood, and so on. We did a couple examples of this, but the key point, and I asked him about this because a lot of people had asked in office hours, how much of this equation do they need to know? This looks really complicated. And what the important thing you need to know is what this equation sort of means in theory. And so the idea is that whether a term is activated, so the example he kept using was Noah, so whether the word Noah comes to mind depends on this letter B, which refers to these base level activations. So what's your baseline exposure to this? So kids who spent longer time in church or maybe learned a little song about Noah and the flood would have a higher baseline activation than somebody who hasn't had as much exposure to that. Then it's also determined by the sum of, so this just means like you're summing up all of the individual weights of that element. And so what this image is showing here is that, so like the input weight for Bible could be 1, and so he said you don't need to be too familiar with this like image and how to work that, but I don't want to mess it up now. Let me just read something. I'm good. He asked me. Okay, so the ACC theory, it assumes that these items are interconnected in some type of predictable way, and that there are these associations, and so some are going to be stronger than others. For example, bread is more strongly associated with butter and more weakly associated with doctor. And so this has implications for memory and how we retrieve it. So when we're in a given context, some items are going to be more readily available than others. And so the equation specifies how the relationship of two items is within a specific context, and so each item or word has an intrinsic or baseline value, that's the B. So for instance, dog has a very high baseline value, but pterodactyl has a very low one, because we're just much less exposed to that word. So we're able to generate or recall pterodactyl on its own is very low, but our ability to generate dog is much higher. And so within a specific context, for example, if you're talking about dinosaurs, or you are a paleontologist, then the likelihood of accessing that is going to be higher than accessing dog. And so that's adding the context, the sum of the weighted S's to the baseline. So that's the S here. So you're adding up the cues from the context. And so that will give us our total activation. So it's your baseline activation plus the sum of the weights of the context. And so in his example, it was like after we had been presented with flood and Bible and animal, then you get to Noah, because you've got enough of these weighted associations to cue that. Whereas so the baseline activation is low for Noah, but once you get enough of those weighted contributing elements, then you'll activate Noah. And so there's some exceptions to this, but for the most part, this model explains the bulk of the data, that when we're free associating a word in a given subject, it's basically showing us how we free associate, that you think of the most accessible thing, but the context also influences that. So again, if you've just been talking about dinosaurs and flying, then you're going to access pterodactyl. It also explains priming. So like once you've heard one word, it makes it more likely that you'd access another one. Any questions on that? So that's just saying that same thing in words. So this is demonstrating this with the nurse. So nurse and butter are both words. Nurse and doctor are both words. Nard and doctor, those are not both words, so you would respond no here, but people are much faster to identify when there's two words that are related. So people are much faster at saying yes for nurse and doctor than they are for nurse and butter. And so this is an example of this spreading activation, that the activation for nurse spreads and then it primes for doctor, so we're much faster to access that. Yes, that's a word. Yes, these are both words. So we're much faster there. he didn't talk about this side of the graph, but on this side, this is just saying that we are faster when the words are related, when they're bread and butter versus when they're nurse and butter, they take longer. And so we can change our baseline activation with practice. So the more you're exposed to something, then the strength of that memory trace would be greater. Activation level can change, but the actual strength of a memory trace changes more gradually. So each time we use a memory trace, it increases a little bit in strength. So each time you access a piece of information, it's easier to access the next time. So the strength of its trace determines in part how active it can become. If it's not very strong at all, it's going to be harder to activate. The strength of a trace can be gradually increased by repeated practice. So this is what studying or rehearsing does. So now we're getting to the effects of practice on memory. These are very large. So this is just showing that a study that basically it fits a power function. So people read these sentences and they examine the effect of practice, and so people get much faster at recognizing that they've seen the sentence before, but that sort of tapers off as it approaches a certain speed that we can only get so fast, and it's basically diminishing returns, that after a certain point you're not going to get much faster. So it fits a power function. And then he made this point, and I think all you need to know about this is just that in some of the studies that he gets to later, they talk about these type of power results, but did they log transform them so it looks like a linear relationship? And so that's just what he means, is that sometimes it'll be shown in this form of it's actually a power relationship, and sometimes it's shown in this form, but they actually mean the same thing. It's just a way of transforming the data. So it's a mathy thing. But don't get intimidated by the equations up here. If you want to know more about what log transforming is, you can ask me later or look that up on Wikipedia or something. And so then what this is showing is in this Blackburn study, they did this practice doing addition over 10,000 different trials, and so people get better, and it also fits this power function. So again, this is a log scaled one, so it looks like a straight line, but really if we plotted this with raw values, it would look like the other one where it's in a power function with an asymptote down here. So we get better over time, but with diminishing returns. You don't each time you get better, but less better, I guess would be the way to say. They're saying that this law the fact that it fits this power function might be related to basic neural changes, and this is the idea of long-term potentiation, which is that when a pathway is stimulated with a high frequency current, or you're using it frequently, then it becomes stronger, and so it's more likely to activate later. So it becomes more sensitive. It's easier to access that information as it's used more. So this is showing that the effects of practice decrease with increasing practice. So this is showing the same thing, just kind of in the opposite way, that the more you practice, the percent change in how good you get tapers off. This is just showing it in the opposite way. Now our graph is going like this instead of like this, but it's showing the same type of relationship. It's just that instead of number correct, it's the percent change in how well you did. And again, it fits, if you log transform it, it fits a straight line, showing that it's a power function. So these ones. So that we use the hippocampus and the prefrontal regions in retrieving memory. We can assess this with the bold response. This is the study of hippocampal damage. So when the hippocampus is damaged, so this is just when you have a hippocampal damage, even though you show the same activation in the prefrontal cortex, those memories never actually get stored because of the damage. So you need both to be working properly to remember things. we've got our left prefrontal, so this is a study with fMRI, and so they were looking at this left prefrontal region, and so showing that we see a less strong fold response in words that are ultimately not remembered. And so even at the time of trying to learn these things, at encoding, if we looked at the brain image, we could tell which ones the person's going to remember or not remember. We see a different amount of activation for words that are remembered. And same with pictures. Similar thing, that this, the ones that are forgotten don't show the same peak of activation. So I know we're running low on time. What I can do is I can keep going and I'll record this. I totally understand that people need to leave. There's a lot of material to pack in, so maybe I should schedule a longer time. I'm sorry about that. So yeah, I'll just keep going, but I won't be offended if you leave, and it'll be on the recording. And also you can feel free to come. Well, that's too late. Office hours are on Thursday, but you can email me questions as well. I'm good about getting back to emails. So, okay, so our memory is really forgotten. In doing these when people are under the knife for neurosurgery, you can stimulate parts of the temporal lobe, and people will remember things that they had never remembered before. So the idea here is that those memory traces are there, but that we're not able to access them, and that's why we're not remembering things from our childhood. Yeah.
I'm sorry, did we just skip to another lecture, or is this in the same?
So that was the end of what we got to.
Oh, okay. So after that, we don't need to.
Yeah, and it wasn't, and nothing past this was on the study guide. So yeah. So now we're on this memory 2 lecture. These are shorter. So these, so now we're answering the question of are memories really forgotten? So in these Nelson experiments, they had people learn these 20 pairs where they paired a number with a word, so like 43 dogs, so they remembered all of those. And so when they could do the whole thing without any errors, that's when they learned it. And then 2 weeks later, they're able to recall about 75% of these pairings. But did they really get the other 25%? So the way that they looked at this was they had a new round of learning where of the ones that they missed, they either paired those with the same thing again, so they kept the ones that they missed, and they just basically relearned those 25% that they missed, or they changed those. So they changed what the number linked to. So this, so what they found is that people were very good at recalling the unchanged items at 78%, but the changed ones, they only recalled it 43%. And so what this suggests is that there's some trace of memory left. That they, if there was nothing left of those ones that they had gotten wrong, these two rates should be the same, because it should be like you're just learning again from scratch, but they're not. There's still some information that they're holding on to, and that's why they do better here. And that's just what that says. This is the same thing, but this time with recognition versus recall. So just being able to pick it out of like basically multiple choice instead of generating it. So again, they do better with the unchanged than the changed. So this is just saying that those memories are still there. They're just not as strong as the ones that were remembered. Then we get to sort of 3 different people's examinations of the retention function, which refers to how well you retain information. So Ebbinghaus was the first to do this with the for getting curve, or the memory retention function. And so just had people memorize these lists of nonsense syllables in order, and then once they could reproduce that whole thing in the correct way every time that they had said they remembered it, then after some intervention, they had to read that, recall that list, and so see how many times the list, after they have a period of to just see if they retain it, then they'll test their retention. Most people don't get everything right the first time, but then how many times do they have to rehearse the list before they can do it totally correct again? And they compare that number to the number of times it took the first time around. And so that's called your percent savings. So it's like if you had to memorize, like, for example, I'm having a really hard time memorizing my partner's phone number because we don't memorize phone numbers anymore, but each time I relearn it, it takes fewer times. So, right, like I'll be there when I visit, I'll practice like 20 times to like learn the phone number because I need it for the grocery store to get the discount, right? And then, but the next time I go, maybe it only takes 5 times, and then 3 times, and that difference is my percent savings. And so it looks something like this, that after a certain interval, it asymptotes off. Whickle-Green found the same thing, and he just did it with a similar study, but with this time with 600 words that were, they had to say whether the words that they had, whether they had seen them before or not, and they found the same thing of memory strength decreasing over time with a delay. This is just showing the same thing that Ebbinghaus found with a different study. Just to reiterate that this is a real effect and it's been replicated. This is showing the same thing, that it fits a power function. And then this guy also showed a similar thing, Barrick, with language and vocabulary retention. This is over a much longer period of time, which is why it doesn't look exactly the same, but just that the more exposure you have to something, so if you took 5 courses in a language instead of 1, you'll have a better test scores, better memory, but all of those are going to taper off over time, but at some point sort of stagnate, that you have that, so this basically lines up with that bottom part of that forgetting curve, where you're down here now, and that kind of tapers off at this flat. So he just found the same effect. Then we've got our 2 theories of forgetting, our decay theory and our interference theory. So decay is that the memory traces decay in strength over time, and interference is that idea that memories interfere with one another when you're trying to retrieve them. So evidence for interference effects is in this Keppel study. So they did this paired associates learning again. So that's like the 43 dog, 61 house type task again that we saw before. So they memorize a list like A, B, and then subjects also get either another list like AD, where the same words are paired to different numbers, or a list like CD, where they're just totally different words, but the numbers are the same. So they're varying different things there. And so what they find is, so they want to know, how does learning of one list of paired associates affect memory for the other list? And so group 1 learns AB and AD. So in group 2, this is, learns list AB and list CD. And I think this is correct. I don't think this should have had the same numbers. Because these don't, right? These should be totally different in group 2. It's learning 2 lists that the words are different and the numbers are different. After a week, they're tested on this, and so the experimental group learns the second list more slowly, the AD, because of proactive interference. So both things happen. So they're slower to learn the new list because they've already learned the first one, and they also have poor retention for the first list, which is the retroactive interference. So it interferes with learning new things, that's the proactive, and it interferes with things you have learned, that's the retroactive. Then this fan effect, and so what this is that with spreading activation, the idea that when you present it with a stimulus like cat, activation will spread to its associates, so like dog or whiskers. One second. And so the fan effect is how wide that activation can spread. Yeah.
Just to confirm for the study we just went over, that he never said anything about like the control group results, right? Like the separate lists. It was just like focused on
Those should have been just, yeah, he didn't say anything about it, but it should be that they didn't have this retroactive and proactive interference because they're totally separate lists, right? Like it's not like we have a limited capacity to learn things. We just can't like learn new associates for something that we've already learned them before. It's harder. That's a great question. So the more associates you have for something, that activation is going to be less strong for each different associate. You only have so much activation to go around, whereas if there's only a few associates, then you're going to have less spreading, so there's going to be more activation for each of those associates. This is the fan effect. And so the way they showed this is they had a bunch of different sentences, and so the fan, what they're talking about here is that, for example, like the sentence, the lawyer is in the park, there's multiple sentences with lawyer and multiple sentences with park, so there's 2 of each, so that's why it's 2-2. So this has a fan of, I believe it's 4, because there's 4 different things that are associates with it, and so the number of, yeah, first to that. And so then they're given these same sentences or new sentences by repairing these different things, and they have to say whether they've seen this before, and they measure their reaction times, and basically how long it takes you to recognize something increases as both a function of the number of facts you're studying about that person and the number of facts about the location or the fan. So how many facts there are that list lawyer and park. So that's going to, the more of those that there are, the harder it is to remember. And when they do fMRI studies, they show, again, the similar effect that we saw before, that we have a greater bull response in relation to high fan stimuli than low fan. So ones that have multiple repeated things, we have a higher activation. The idea is that the brain is working harder in these more difficult cases. So this is interference again. So here's the idea of Lewis and Anderson study. So can the fan effect be obtained with facts that the participant knew before? So this is the one where they learn things like Napoleon was from India. These fantasy facts, it's very appropriate now. And so they learned some of these fantasy facts, and then they took a recognition test and had to say true or false to 3 different kinds of sentences, ones that were these fantasy facts, ones that were actual facts, and things that were just totally false and hadn't been learned as fantasy facts. And so this is looking at their reaction time. So people were, on the whole, always faster at recognizing actual true facts, then experimentally true, and then false ones. But as they learned more fantasy facts, they actually got worse at recognizing these actually true things. They got slower at saying that Napoleon is an emperor. Yeah.
Were they taught true facts too, or was it just supposed to be general knowledge?
It's supposed to be the general knowledge. They didn't. Yeah, they expected them to know that he was an emperor. That's showing that. Interference and redundancy. So interference occurs when one is learning multiple pieces of information that have no intrinsic relationship to one another, but it doesn't occur when the learning is redundant or related, which makes sense. So the idea is that learning facts like Locke was unhappy, he felt like fruits were wholesome, those are totally unrelated, whereas facts like Mozart made the long journey because he wanted to leave Munich, those are all related facts. And so when people are in these different conditions, they recall these facts in different ways. And so when they're in this, such weird slides. So with the single fact, when they're given just one fact and they're asked to immediately recall, they do very well, and they do just as well, if not better, with 3 relevant facts. They do much worse when they're trying to recall 3 irrelevant or unrelated facts, and then 1 week later they do the best by far when they had these 3 facts that are relevant. And so this again kind of gets us back to that idea of meaning. When you have a meaningful thing and information that hangs together, it's easier to remember than isolated or irrelevant or less meaningful pieces of information. This is just summing up that same thing. We often aren't able to retrieve a particular fact directly, so we either retrieve related facts and then use those to infer a fact. We're often unaware that we've done this. And so this can lead to correct answers, but also to incorrect ones. So this study is showing that. So this is the one where they had 3 turtles were resting beside a log, and a fish swam beneath them. And they're later asked to say if they had studied this sentence, that the 3 turtles rested beside a floating log and the fish swam beneath it. So this means something slightly different. And so most subjects say correctly that no, these are not the same. But if they studied 3 turtles rested on a floating log and the fish swam beneath them, and then they're later asked if they saw the sentence 3 turtles rested on a floating log and a fish swam beneath it, they do say that they had seen that before because it has the same type of meaning. And that interferes because it's relevant. So more subjects thought this was a studied sentence because number 2 implies this number 4. Again, this is the interference and retrieval. So this is the one with Helen Keller and this random person, Carol Harris. So if they read this story about Carol Harris, they didn't falsely remember that she was deaf, dumb, and blind. And this was not in the original story, but if they had heard that this was Helen Keller, they often recalled that that was the case because they had learned it elsewhere. It was interfering. Bias to the memory for text. Your previous knowledge made you think that that was actually in there. That's the same thing. This is a study just saying that people are very accurate at recalling whether or not something is plausible, especially when they're told to just remember this, when they're told to not remember every single thing about this passage, but just remember what was plausible, what was happening in it. Here's the graph we need. So what they found is that the reaction time to say whether this sentence was in the study right afterward, people are very fast, and so do very well when they've been told to recall every exact thing in the study. But as time goes on, and there's a delay, that gets worse and worse. They can no longer hold on to that exact information. But when they're told to just remember what's plausible and what's happening in that story, at first they're not as good, but as time goes on, they do better and better at that. So we're able to hold on to that kind of information. That is that plausible in the story? Does that make sense than actual specific little facts or how it's worded? That's what that's showing. Then we've got our Owen study. So this is subject study a story about a college student and the day in her life, and this is the one where it's just a boring story about she goes to the doctor, and then with group 2 they get this additional information that, oh, she might be pregnant, and it's exciting and a big deal. And so the prediction is that people remember more when there's a theme that's with the story, when there's more of this meaning behind it. And so after 24 hours they're asked to recall this, and indeed they do much better at recalling things in this themed condition. It's 29 and 15 versus 20 and 3. Okay, last one. So here we're talking about Elizabeth Loftus's famous studies on eyewitness testimony. She's super, super famous and has a bunch of work that shows that you can get people to remember things that they didn't actually see, like that Donald Duck was at Disneyland, even though he's not a Disney character, things like that. So what the study we talked about was that they have subjects view this film of a traffic accident, and they're asked to just describe the scene, and then they ask them this question of either how fast were the cars going when they hit each other, or how fast were they going when they smashed into each other or made contact with one another. And what's important is which word you use actually influences how fast participants remember the car going. So they think it was going much faster when it was smashed versus when it was contacted. Then the question is this because the word biases the response, or it actually changes the memory? And so this study shows really that it actually changes the memory. So then they're asked later on, was there any broken? So it's the same first part, and then a week later they're asked if there was any broken glass, and the wording of that question a week previously influenced their response to this question that's happening a week later. And so what this indicates is that it's not just biasing their response; it's actually changing the memory and how it's encoded. So this is just showing that they thought that there was broken glass when it was smashed at a much higher rate than when it was hit or when they weren't asked that question at all. And then same with the speed estimates. Then this misinformation is just showing a similar thing, that so there's this car that's stopped at either there's actually a yield sign there or just a post that could have a yield sign on it, and they're asked, did another car pass the red dot sign while it was stopped at the yield sign? And then after a while, they're asked if there was a yield sign and how confident. And so people who actually the sign was there, they were 76% accurate in saying yes, indeed there was a yield sign. But people who there was no sign for but had this question, 25% of them said yes, there was a yield sign. So not everybody's wrong, but there's a significant number of people who remember that being there because of this question. That's suggesting that there's a yield sign there. They're less confident in it, but they do remember seeing it there for some portion of people. So this is just summing up that general paradigm. It's showing the same thing. Now we're getting to false memories. So this is these people's study. So their paradigm is that, oh, this is the one where they read you a list of words like sleep, bed, cuddle, all those kind of things, and they ask you if those other words are on that list. And people are very good at saying when the word really was on the original list, they get that correct. But they're very bad at saying when the word was not on the original list, but it's highly related. So if, for example, pillow wasn't on the list, but then we say pillow because it's highly related to all those other words about sleep, people will say, yes, I saw that. But they're also really good at saying, no, I didn't see pancake or carrot on there, because it's totally unrelated. So this study is just showing that, again, we can have false memories for things that seem like they make sense. These are just the stats on that. Then looking in the brain, so how does the brain process this information? Looking at the hippocampus specifically, we see that the false words and the true words actually look very similar in how they're activating here. So the hippocampus doesn't seem to know the difference, whereas the new words it is responding to in a different way. There's no difference in activation in the hippocampus between these correctly identified words like sleep and the incorrectly identified words like pillow, for example. But then when we look at the hippocampal gyrus, we see that now it's looking different, where the true words are having a different pattern of activation than the false, and the new ones are looking much more similar. So some part of our brain knows that these ones were not on the list. The parahippocampal gyrus. If we were just to look at that activation, we would be able to, from that, know which ones were on the list or not. But importantly, the person can't report on that. So the effects of encoding context. This is all the information about the context in which you learn something will influence how well you remember it. So when you learn something in a windowless room, you're better at recalling it in that same windowless room than when you learn something in the open room, you're better at recalling it in that open room. That's what that study was showing. So they do better when they're recalling the list in the same setting that they learned it in versus another setting. So that's why you should study where you take an exam, presumably. Then they did showed the same effect with scuba divers doing things either underwater or on shore. This literally shows the exact same effect, where they have this crossover interaction where if you learned it in a dry environment, you recall better in a dry environment. If you learned it in a wet environment, you recall better in a wet environment. The magnitude of this effect depends on how well you integrate things with the context, so that so this study, they had people either like imagine a kite, just like a kite on its own or in the sky, versus imagining the kite in the room that you're in. And so if they imagined it in the room that they're in, which is the idea is that you're integrating the learning with the context, then you see an even stronger effect of recalling things in the place that you learned it. So you imagined a kite on that desk there. Now that I'm back in this room, I remember that I saw the word kite because I imagined it over there, as opposed to just in the sky. Mood has the same effect as other types of context. So if you were hypnotically placed in a positive state and you learn words in that state, you're going to recall them better in that positive state. If you learn words in a negative state, you're going to recall those better in a negative state. So the sum of that is that you have better recall when your emotional state matches the emotional state you were in when you studied. And so this is showing a similar effect. They just didn't hypnotically induce these states. They just had subjects learn either positive words, negative words, or neutral words in just a normal state, and then they manipulated whether they were in a positive mood or a neutral, or a positive mood or a depressed mood, and then they asked them to recall those words. So when people were in a happy mood, so when they were feeling elated, they remembered many more positive words than negative words. If they were in a depressed mood, they remembered more negative words than positive, and the neutral ones sort of went slightly up. Often neutral is perceived as kind of negative because we want positive things. So that's probably why that's a slightly positive score. So again, people recall more words that match their mood. And this also relates to this state-dependent learning with drugs and alcohol also. So we're showing the same effect here, that if people, go right to the graph, so if they were smoking a regular cigarette when they were learning the list of words or whatever it was that they were studying, they then recalled more of those when they were smoking a cigarette later than when they were smoking marijuana. If they learned the words when they were smoking marijuana, they did quite well at recalling those words when they were again smoking marijuana, but not very well when they were smoking a cigarette. So again, it shows the context matching effect. So what happens with the context itself, like the physical environment, with your mood, and with like your drug-induced state as well. This last one is showing a similar thing with context, just that when we're given two words like sky blue, and you said you only really need to pay attention to the second word, so you really don't need to remember blue. Later on, you're asked to say if you've seen this before, and they either give you just blue or they give you the full cue sky blue. People do better when they have the full cue, because that's the context that they learned it in. And the last bit about amnesia, again, so we're jumping back to HM, and then they've got a couple other examples of people who had similar types of memory loss. again, retrograde and amnesia, and anterograde, the two different flavors. So this is just showing how sort of the time course of retrograde and anterograde amnesia changes over time as you recover from, for example, a traumatic brain injury. So at first, there's basically almost total retrograde amnesia for like up to 2 years. The actual timing of these things will be different for different individuals, but the principle is that at first you have a lot of retrograde amnesia and also some issues with things that happen even earlier than that. Then you have total anterograde amnesia too afterward, where for some time you're not able to form new memories. Then as time goes on, that period of retrograde amnesia starts to shrink. You start to regain some of those past memories, and the time of the anterograde amnesia also starts to shrink. You start to be able to form new memories, and then after 16 months, they have pretty much a normal memory for the time preceding the episode, except for right beforehand and maybe right afterward. And the idea here is that this is the key thing, and that what happened right before that trauma never made it to long-term memory, so it's lost, because that was what was in working memory and hadn't been pushed into long-term memory, and so you never re-uncover what happened right before the trauma. That's what he was illustrating with this. And then he had some amnesia facts. These mostly are things that we already covered, but a nice summary of things, and then that was where that lecture ended. So, any questions before you all head out? Yeah.
So on Bachelor Space, he has that Midterm 2 guide. So it doesn't appear like he has anything on there that's going to be learned tomorrow. Is that true, or is that like under that context section?
Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I had it for Psych 3 last quarter, and there were some things in the slide that wasn't on the fair name sheet, and then someone asked him about it in class, and he said that everything that he teaches is fair name.
Okay, so he just may not update this.
Yeah, what I imagine is that he made this and he hadn't already prepared his next lecture, so he doesn't know. And I don't think the exam is made yet. So we'll just have to go with whatever he says next time and take notes on that. I'd be happy to answer any questions by email that people have of that. Yeah.
So it's just going to be from the lecture after our last midterm to tomorrow?
Yes. So it starts with that, what is it? What's that first one? Retention, I think, or? Yeah, a mental representation is the first lecture, and then through tomorrow. That's what you're responsible for. Anything else? Yeah.
There's stuff from like last lecture, you know how you cut off, like there's still stuff that's on the sheet, like the review sheet. If he doesn't go over it tomorrow, should we still like learn it ourselves?
Does he have? There's more in the review sheet that he didn't get to in class.
Yeah.
I will ask him tomorrow, because I don't know if he's going to go back and pick up there for next lecture, or if he's going to start a new topic, right? Like, because this was the last one we ended last class, so he may pick up here and be planning to cover that, and that may be it, and that's why there's no stuff from another topic on the study guide. So I guess we won't know till tomorrow, unfortunately, so sorry I can't answer that. But if we don't cover it, you're not responsible, and he did confirm that, and I will back y'all up if it ends up on the exam, and we'll dump that.
Sweet. For that, there was like one, I asked you.